It's a remarkable achievement from the government that they have a budget surplus of, I think it's 25 billion. The Minister can correct me if I'm wrong. I think it's about 25 billion or in that region. And they have a windfall of 13 plus billion in Apple tax money that they didn't want, because they would have preferred that Apple, a staggeringly wealthy and profitable company, would have had it instead, but they were forced to take this 13 billion from Apple, giving them an extraordinary amount of money. And yet, ordinary workers and the very least well off in our society will either just about keep pace with the cost of living and inflation, or in the case of some of the poorest in our society, will actually be marginally worse off. Now, that is an extraordinary achievement, to have that much money at your disposal, and for the workers who generate that wealth to be no better off or possibly worse off is an immense achievement. And you'd have to ask yourself, how could that possibly happen? And it's also very dispiriting, I think, for working people, because when the country was on its knees following the financial crash caused by the activities of property developers and banks and speculators, workers got it in the neck and saw their incomes slashed, saw their tax burden massively increased, and saw expenditure in key things like housing and public services slashed, leaving a legacy that still remains with us today of the worst housing and homelessness crisis the country has ever seen, a persistent and ongoing crisis in our health service, and the continuation of things like the universal social charge, which were introduced supposedly as temporary emergency taxes, but continue to persist. And now the government say, and even sadly some of the opposition, such as Deputy Nash, seem to think it would almost be sacrilege to suggest that we get rid of, although that was promised at the time they were introduced as emergency taxes. So in very simple terms, what the lesson of the last decade or so is, when the country's on its knees, the workers get it in the neck and the rich and big business are bailed out. And when the country has record amounts of money available to it, is booming like it's never been booming before, has profit rates that we've never seen before, the workers get it in the neck and the rich are protected. To the point that even the ESRI are calling you out for having missed the opportunity to eliminate poverty. I mean, that's pretty remarkable. That you had the money to eliminate poverty and you didn't do it. Much of that poverty generated through the previous austerity period, and you didn't do it. So if you don't do it when the country's on its knees, and you don't do it when the country has more money than it knows what to do with, it would be understandable for people to say, well, you're never going to do it, are you? You're never going to eliminate poverty. You have absolutely no serious intention of it, because if you can't do it then, and you can't do it now, when are you going to do it? Of course, the answer is you're never going to do it. I think it was Michael McDowell one day gave the game away when he said, you know, that a certain level of poverty and inequality in society was kind of necessary to give people a bit of incentive. Right, that is the actual thinking of the people who run this country. And the shocking other side of it is, while all of that is happening, while people suffered austerity, continue to suffer the consequences of austerity, and now when we've more money than we ever had, they still get nothing out of it, and not an additional, with all that surplus, very important, not additional extra social or affordable house promised by the government. Not a single extra one beyond what was previously committed. Again, an absolutely extraordinary achievement. That with all that money available, you can't promise even an extra social or affordable house. But while all of that is happening, the profits of the corporations and the wealth of the super rich just going through the roof. I mean, it's worth reading out the figures. because they do tell a story that is hardly ever even commented upon. The only people who think about them are the central bank when they produce the reports, or the revenue when they produce reports. In 2013, total corporate profits in this country were 80 billion euro. The next year they were 95 billion euro. The next year they were 143 billion euro. The next year they were 158 billion euro. Then they went to 159 billion euro, then they went to 190 billion, then they went to 203 billion, then they went to 199 billion, marginally down there, and then jumped up to 256 billion, and then in 2022 went up to 317 billion, and probably are around 350 billion for last year, although we don't have the up-to-date figures. And they paid between 4.6 and at most 7.1% tax on the gross trading profits that they made in any given year. They manage that feat because the government gives lots of allowances and deductions and tax credits, which are renewed every year, tax expenditures, but most people don't really know about them, but they allow these enormous profits that the taxable profit is massively written down. Now, the interesting thing about this, that ordinary workers, because all these figures can befuddle people, but the interesting thing that people should know is that total corporation tax paid by these companies last year was 22 billion, and people are saying, oh, that's a lot of money, and by the way, we can't spend it because it mightn't be there for a while. Workers paid a lot more than that, significantly more than that 22 billion. The biggest contributor to the revenues that are available to the state remain workers. But did the combined income of workers, given that they're paying more tax, was their combined income more or less than the gross profits of those companies? Because seeing as they're paying more, you would think their gross income would be a lot more, but it isn't. It's significantly less. So workers pay more and earn less. The corporations pay less and earn more. And those profits have gone up through the roof. Through the roof. To absolutely extraordinary levels. And they pay proportionately more tax per euro than ordinary workers. So that is the real story. And then who benefits from that? Well, the Irish rich and of course the international rich, whether they're investment funds, vulture funds, big corporations or whatever, they are the ones who benefit from all this, and the Irish rich also are part of that. So in the central bank quarterly accounts, Q4 2023, the net worth of Irish households was greater than 1.1 trillion euro, an increase of 33 billion euro in just the last quarter of 2023. That's an amazing fact given to us by the central bank. That includes 527 billion of financial assets and 738 billion in housing assets. And the interesting point then is the central bank tells us that 10% of Irish households own 54% of all that wealth. 54%, 10%. The richest 1% own 35.4%. So, the richest 10% of people own 550 billion euro. That's unbelievable. It's mind-boggling. It's so mind-boggling, people can't actually get their head around it, and it's never commented on. But to bring it down to brass tacks, that means in Ireland there are now more than 10 billionaires. There are 1,400 individuals with wealth that is over 47 million euro, and over 20,000 individuals with wealth in excess of 4.7 million euro. 20,000 people who've more than 4.5 million euro each. Now, what do you do with that kind of information? Well, the first thing is to know it, because that really shows who's benefiting from all the work. And by the way, all that wealth is generated by workers, all of it. Well, Well, you could get rid of the USC, as we propose, for those earning less than 90,000, or less than 100,000 euro a year. And you could more than pay for it. In fact, you'd have several billion left over to pay for getting rid of the austerity tax and maybe redistribute something that the working people lost over the years of austerity by introducing a small wealth tax on all of that money. Just on that top 5%, not even the top 10%, the top 5%, as Oxfam proposed. And which we put in our budget submission. Very similar to the wealth tax we proposed for the last decade, but it's interesting that groups like Oxfam are talking about it, and now some mainstream economists are talking about it, and it is being done in some countries around the world. So we propose a modest 2% net wealth tax on net wealth over 4.7 million. 2%. They wouldn't even feel it, because their wealth is accumulating much more value than that, but it would create a huge amount of money for our public services, for our housing, for our health, for the infrastructure and all the rest of it, or to lift people out of poverty. 3% we propose on wealth over from 50 million to 1 billion, small group of people affected by that, a tiny handful, and a 5% on the wealth that 10 people have over €1 billion. Again, they wouldn't even feel it. That would pay to get rid of the USC for every worker in this country, and would leave several billion left over. One of the big proposals we had, as against what the government have done in this bill, marginal reductions in USC, mostly benefiting sort of middle income workers who deserve a break, but doing very little for the lowest paid. As well as getting rid of the USC, we suggest that there will be a refundable tax credit for the 20% of workers who earn less than €18,750 a year. And that is indeed an amazing fact in and of itself. 20% of workers in this country earn less than €18,750 a year, right? And they don't benefit from tax credits because they don't earn enough. So a refundable tax credit would cost €1.3 billion, but it would give them a very, very significant boost. And they would be precisely the precarious workers, the part-time workers, the people who are really, really struggling in this country. The government's vacant homes tax, which is a scandal, the vacant homes in this country, last year was managed, even though the census found 166,000 empty properties, 65,000 of which are vacant since 2016 and 40,000 have been vacant since 2011. Last year, they only managed to levy the vacant homes tax on 3,500 properties. 3,500 out of that number, and they managed to collect €2 million. Unbelievable. And the biggest scandal probably in the country. Tens of thousands of homes sitting empty and vacant while we're faced in the teeth of a massive homelessness housing crisis, and that's what your vacant homes tax can deliver. Nothing. Whereas we propose a much more ambitious vacant property tax where the tax would apply on all houses left vacant for more than 6 months without good reason, and where there would be €1,000 tax per month on vacant homes, which would force them back into use or generate significant revenue. We should have similarly aggressive taxes on residential zone land, the 15,000 hectares or so of it that's sitting, being hoarded by a small number of property developers and speculators who are helping ratchet up the price of housing by hoarding building land which should and could be used to build affordable housing for the people affected by the housing crisis. So in short, this budget just continues with the same pattern of handing all the benefits of economic growth, of huge profitability, not to the workers who generated it, but to the corporations and the super rich. They won't even put modest taxes on these people to make them pay their fair share, so ordinary workers pick up the tab in terms of the cost of living crisis and the housing crisis. In the last 5 minutes, I just want to talk briefly about the film industry. Once again, but this is typical of the pattern, the film producers have got everything they want. All the things they asked for. Of course they have. They get them every year. New changes to the Section 481 tax film credit, which the producers lobbied for. So that films under 20 million qualifying expenditure will now get an 8% boost, up to 40% tax credit on qualifying expenditure, bringing that's an extra 67 million euro, I believe, along with the one that's going to the unscripted sector. Now, you see, fine. I want to see, and I've long advocated, for even more money to go into arts and culture. We were still well below European average, and certainly the film and audiovisual sector needs to have investment in it. It's an area where we can do a lot better, even in my opinion, that we have, because we have an incredible array of talent, of actors, directors, writers, crew, technical people, you name it. You name it. But has anybody done a study as to how all that money that's being handed to the film producing companies is actually translating in terms of security of income and employment for the performers, the writers, the directors, the crew, and so on? And of course, if you did do that, what you'd find is all of those people live completely precarious existences with no security whatsoever of income and employment. None. Zero. And in the case of the actors, performers, and writers, being robbed of their residuals, the royalties which they should benefit from if certain film productions or TV series are successful and generate downstream revenues for the producers, who are getting the money, I repeat, from the state, from the taxpayer, from those same workers, to finance the films, but they run off with the royalties. Now, in the old days, actors and so on used to get little small checks. If there was a repeat of a series they'd been in 10 years ago, because they live a very precarious existence, they might get little small checks that would come in every now and again, which was a big help when you live such a precarious existence. But now they're being robbed of them because the Irish film producers who get the money every year from you guys, and it keeps going up, don't want to give them the same contracts as are given to actors, performers, writers and directors in England or in the north of Ireland, the Pact Equity Agreement, which they have asked for again and again and again to use as a template for contracts that you should enforce. And I don't know how many times I've asked the question, would you just, and they have asked the question, would you attach conditions to Section 481 such that the contracts that are given to these people will guarantee that they at least get terms and conditions in terms of their residuals akin to those in Britain. The producers are fighting it, and you will not attach the conditions. And I got it again in the last couple of days from the minister saying, we don't attach, there's no contractual obligations, was the phrase, attached to Section 481. Why not? Why not? Why isn't there contractual obligations? They're getting handouts of taxpayers' money, but they don't want to actually give the performers and the creative people the benefit of the profits that are generated by their talent. And so the vast majority of people who work in the arts live in poverty. That's the reality. Live in poverty. And film crew, similarly. Film crew, who I don't know how many times I've brought it up, probably 100 times over the last 10 years, have no protection at all from being blacklisted. And if they ask for their rights under fixed-term workers legislation and directives, they are blacklisted out of the industry and they will never work again. And there are many of them have paid that price. Even though they've worked and their names appear on film credits for years and years, working in the industry, 20, 30 years, painters, stage crew, carpenters, Transport drivers, if they say a word saying, well, I have the right to be re-employed again because your film has been funded and I've worked for you again and again and again, but different DACs, and the film producers hide behind these DACs and say, oh, even though I set up these DACs and set up 20 of them that you worked for over 20 years, I'm not actually the employer, even though I am the employer. Right? And they get away with it, and the government lets them away with it and refuses to attach conditions to Section 481. For God's sake, if you're going to give them this money, and I want money going into the film industry, will you attach conditions that guarantee the rights and decent employment and security and income and some certainty for the crew, for the actors, the writers and